Hi students, I figured I should do a Unit 1 recap since the Unit 1 exam is going to be due this weekend, this Saturday before midnight, and I should probably recap the lesson quizzes that we've had already. I want to say also, just by the way, I've been meaning to make a video to congratulate the class on the excellent class discussions everyone's been having so far. You know, you've all been really carrying the conversation with each other, and you know, I've been really impressed. So it's great to see that. Um, let's go ahead and take a look at the Lesson 2 quiz on Reconstruction. And so we have question 1 here. Which of the following was the main supporter of the 10% plan for readmitting ex-Confederate states into the Union after the Civil War? So the 10% plan was one of the more lenient plans, right? But it did call for some change. It did call for some ex-Confederates to swear loyalty to the Union. So it would not have been supported by the Ku Klux Klan. But it was too lenient to be really supported by the radical Republicans. The Freedmen's Bureau wasn't really a political entity. It was more of just an administrative bureaucracy. So the answer is Abraham Lincoln. Just, if very least by process of elimination. You know, it also helps to know that he was kind of this moderate compromiser who wanted to go fairly leniently on the South. Which law or constitutional amendment effectively freed all slaves in America from slavery in 1865? So a common misconception is that it was the Emancipation Proclamation. It's not quite right, because the Emancipation Proclamation only freed the slaves in the Confederate states that were in rebellion. It did not free the slaves in Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware. So it was not until the 13th Amendment that all the slaves in the entire United States were freed. Question 3. In theory, the 14th Amendment guaranteed which of the following? It would be both equal protection under the laws for African Americans and citizenship. The 15th Amendment guaranteed which of the following? The right of African Americans to vote. That's the answer. There were some people at the time who wanted to go farther and include the women's right to vote in this, but some people thought that was still too controversial, and they wanted to at least get the right of African Americans to vote, you know, into the Constitution. And of course, there were calls as well to redistribute land from ex-Confederates to ex-slaves, which kind of went under the label of 40 acres and a mule, but that never came to pass either. That was seen as a little too radical for even most of the radical Republicans. So that's question 4. Question 5. Oh, and by the way, I very much enjoyed the debate on the discussion forums about whether, you know, the Freedmen Bureau you know, did enough, or whether it could have gone even farther. And I was really surprised to see so many students suggest that it should have gone farther and maybe gone through with something like this 40 acres and a mule plan of land redistribution. You know, I normally don't see that much support for that idea in most semesters. So that was interesting. Question 5 is the Freedmen's Bureau. It helped ex-slaves mainly, but also some poor whites, with food and other immediate assistance. Was not supported by ex-Confederates. They hated it and complained that it was a waste of money. Did not have anything to do with the Emancipation Proclamation, and did not redistribute land to all ex-slaves. Although, once again, it was interesting to hear some of you be in favor of that. That was interesting. Question 6. The enforcement acts passed during the radical Republican phase of Reconstruction were a direct response to the vigilante violence of the Ku Klux Klan. Yeah, pretty straightforward. Question 7. The Black Codes were what? Well, they were laws that made tried to put ex-slaves back into slave-like conditions in the ex-Confederate states, and these attempts at putting these black codes in place kind of created a backlash, made Congress insist on even tougher demands like the 14th and 15th Amendments, when originally they were just going to let the ex-Confederate states off the hook and rejoin the Union after only accepting the 13th Amendment. Interesting. Question 8. The Radical Republicans obtained greater support from voters in the 1868 elections and were able to initiate a more demanding phase of Reconstruction because... yeah, I just referenced that, basically, that this backlash, this frustration against the ex-Confederate states dragging their feet and trying to fight Reconstruction. There were also race riots that made some people in the North outraged at the South at the time. Question 9. Abraham Lincoln's position on slavery at the beginning of the Civil War was to restrict the spread of slavery, but also to restore the Union, even if that meant maintaining slavery in the existing slave states. So once again, he was a moderate, lenient compromiser, not a firebrand abolitionist. Question 10. During Abraham Lincoln's time in office, ex-Confederates suffered which of the following? None of these. They got off, you could argue, somewhat easily. Let's make sure I got everything. Yep, 10 out of 10. Okay. So that is the lesson 2 quiz. Let's look at the lesson 3 quiz real quick on the Western frontier. Question 1. The historian Frederick Jackson Turner argued that the Western frontier shaped America by producing institutions in America very much like those of Europe. These strong collective institutions. No, not really, no. Americans became more individualistic, actually, opposite. Increasing Americans' appreciation of Indian culture, no. At least not right away. There might be some appreciation of Indian culture now, but that took a long time to develop. It was not the case when Frederick Jackson Turner was writing in the 1890s. Stimulating individualism, yes. Killing off the most adventurous individuals, no. Most of those adventurous individuals who went out to the West survived and built the Wild West that we all know and love, right? Question 2. In its long-running battles with the Indians during the late 1800s, the federal government saw all of the following goals except... So did it pressure Indians to adopt white culture? Yes. So that cannot be our answer. Did it arm Indians to help defend U.S. territory against Mexico and Canada? No. They would not. The U.S. government did not want to put more guns in the hands of Indians. It's the last thing they would have wanted. So that is our answer. That's the exception. Did it enable whites to settle and develop important mineral and agricultural resources on former Indian lands? Yes. Did it make Indians more dependent on the U.S. government and more easily controlled? Yes. So that's question 2. So the answer is here, arming Indians. It's not what the federal government did. Question 3, which diplomatic agreement claimed the greatest amount of new territory on the Western frontier? That would be the Mexican Cession of 1848 from the Mexican-American War. That's where most of the vast majority of the territory out west, that's how it was obtained for the U.S. Question 4. Which of these were not a resource that lured Americans to the West in the 1800s? That would be uranium. That was not a relevant resource at the time. These others were, definitely. Question 5. What is this political cartoon referencing? That would be the Chinese Exclusion Act. These are supposed to be Chinese. A very unfavorable caricature of the Chinese, of course. Question 6. Native Americans responded to the frustration of life on reservations in all of the following ways, except they did not kill off the buffalo populations for sport. So that's the answer. But they did do the ghost dance, occasionally have victorious battles, although rare. Battle of Little Bighorn is one example. And participating in the Native American church that used peyote. Question 7. Native Americans faced all of the following problems on reservations except they did face this problem: embezzlement of funds by the Bureau of Indian Affairs, difficulty with making a living due to poor land and too few buffalo. Yep, they faced that problem. Pressure to assimilate Indian children to white culture. Yep, they faced that problem. Increased warfare between neighboring Indian groups. Nope. That would have required the U.S. to arm Indians, and that's the last thing the U.S. wanted to do. They did not want to do that. Question 8. The Dawes Severalty Act basically sought to weaken tribal ties by encouraging Indians to split off and own their land individually. Question 9. Chinese immigrants in the American West in the late 1800s tended to be confined to the lowest paid and lowest status jobs. They usually came over as single men, not as families. Arrived in fewer numbers after 1882, after the Chinese Exclusion Act, and did not have equal access, to the same sort of rights that whites had to claim, settle on land, free land. And question 10, which of the following transportation improvements started making travel and shipping to and from the western frontier easier starting in the 1870s? So the Oregon Trail starts in the 1830s. Panama Canal not until the early 1900s. Interstate highway system isn't really until the 1950s for the most part. So we're talking about the Transcontinental Railroad here. Finished in the 1870s. And we got it. And the last one, I'm not going to show Lesson 5 quiz because some people might still be working on it. But the Lesson 4 one we'll take a look at on the Gilded Age. And by the way, the reason I'm showing these, I'm going over this, is a lot of the questions on the Unit 1 exam, at least on the multiple choice section, will closely, they'll be similar to the ones I'm going, not exactly the same word for word, but they will be somewhat similar to these ones I'm going over here. Question 1. Businesses enjoyed high profits during the Gilded Age for all of the following reasons except... So did they get favorable pro-business rulings by the Supreme Court? Yes, they did, such as the slaughterhouse cases, and that's more dealing with Reconstruction, but such as the Sugar Trust case, the Wabash versus Illinois case. There's a couple of examples, but generally you don't need to remember those examples. Just know that the Supreme Court helped them out. There were productivity improvements. There were not very low tariff rates by historical standards. There were very high tariff rates compared to, for example, the tariff rates today. Even after Trump bumping the tariff rates back up a bit, they still don't nearly approach what they were in the late 1800s. So there were very high tariff rates. This is the exception. But there were very low income tax rate. In fact, there was no federal income tax at all. So aside from having to pay the high tariffs, there were very low to almost no taxes on businesses. It was only if they imported goods from abroad. Question 2. Andrew Carnegie's Gospel of Wealth promoted the idea that people with immense wealth, such as himself, should establish philanthropic institutions that would help the poor better than they could help themselves, supposedly. Right? He did not want to just pass on money to his own workers. Didn't really talk about funding missionary efforts, and did not advocate hoarding and accumulating as much wealth as the wealthy could. That's exactly what he was arguing against. Question 3. In the late 1800s, American wage laborers faced all of the following hardships except paying high income taxes on their wages. So neither did workers pay income taxes either. So they got that one little perk, I suppose. But they also had no welfare programs or, Medicare, Medicaid, unemployment insurance, and that's the sort of thing their taxes would have gone towards if they had paid taxes. So it's kind of a double-edged sword. Yes, they got to keep their paycheck, they're in full pretty much, but also they were on their own if they got laid off. Of course, they did face dangerous working conditions, work long hours, lived in cramped, unsanitary and urban neighborhoods. Question 4, the Knights of Labor was not content with the wage system. They wanted a society of worker-owned cooperatives eventually. So this is the answer here. They fell by the wayside and actually, became a defunct organization by the early 1900s, while the AFL outpaced them. So they did not catch up and surpass the AFL. And they did not rely mainly on violent tactics. They mainly relied on peaceful protests and strikes. They were not quite like the anarchists, right? Question 5. The American Federation of Labor wanted to... No, they did not want to establish state ownership over all the major industries. Not anything that radical. Focus on winning pay increases and improved working conditions for the most skilled white male workers. Yes, that is what they focused on. Include all workers of any occupation or ethnicity into one big union. Nope. That was more of the IWW strategy, the industrial workers of the world. The American Federation of Labor, by contrast, wanted to limit immigration and limit other ethnicities into certain trades, because they thought that that was the best way to safeguard their wages, instead of including those workers into the union. And then they did not want to do anything as radical as a general strike, for sure. The AFL was the most moderate labor union. Question 6. Self-described anarchists in the U.S. in the late 1800s did not favor free market capitalism over big government socialism. This is a common misconception. They hated capitalism just as much, if not more, than the government back then. They were against all hierarchy, so the government was just one of the things they were against. They were also against economic inequality of any sort. They were not nihilists. They had principles, they had goals. They were not just trying to destroy humanity. Although someone, I guess, could argue that their goals would have inadvertently had the same effect, because if you argue that their society would not actually function. But that's not how the anarchists saw themselves. They weren't directly just trying to destroy things. They may have been mistaken, but they were not like rabid destroyers of things for no reason. This is another stereotype of them at the time, but generally untrue. Most were sincere believers in their ideas. They were not foreign spies or agents sent to stir up trouble. You hear this sort of stuff nowadays, by the way, like on Twitter about like recent protests. And that they're being funded by George Soros or funded by other troublemaking entities. And that seems more complicated than just the simple answer that they believe in what they're saying. And they may be mistaken about it. It's an interesting question to ask, why do they, if you happen to, disagree that their anarchist society is feasible, it's an interesting question to ask, why do they believe what they do? that society could function without government or private property and just function based on a bunch of different communes. Supposedly, I don't. Uh, it's a bit vague, but it depends on which anarchist you ask, I guess. But you can ask, why do they believe their beliefs? Where did they go wrong? Or that's a fair question to ask. But to ask, like, who's paying them, who's putting them up to it, who's because obviously they can't be sincerely believing protesters. Yeah, that's a little uncharitable. They actually, I'm sure there are some agent provocateurs occasionally, who maybe are planted by, who knows, the police or their opponents to do something. But I even doubt that for the most part. I think a lot of anarchists sincerely get frustrated that their goals seem very distant, and they just are very, they have kind of an attitude of by any means necessary. So while I don't think most of them are foreign agents, I don't think most of them are agent provocateurs of the police, which is sometimes an argument you hear from like liberal allies to kind of apologize for violence you see at some of these protests. That, oh, those aren't real protesters. It's just police or right-wingers trying to frame protesters as being violent. I doubt it in most cases. It really, I knew some anarchists in my time, in my earlier youth, to say the least, and they're fairly militant. They believe passionately in their cause, let's say, and most of them are willing to take fairly drastic actions to try to bring it about. So, so just based on my experience, don't generally think this is true. Certainly wasn't true in the late 1800s. But this is a way to accurately describe them. Yeah. Wanted to replace wage slavery, as they called capitalism, and centralized government with non-hierarchical hippie communes, right? Who knows? Could be possible someday, but I don't know. I'm a little skeptical. Question 7. Socialists such as American utopian novelist Edward Bellamy wanted not so much this. That's more of a progressive era thing, living free from vice and sin. He did basically propose this, yes. If you read the excerpt, that's what he wanted. He did not want to go back to a simpler, less centralized form of production. He thought that would result in less prosperity. He thought that he liked modern technology, and he liked the modern centralization of technology that seemed to be more efficient. He just didn't like the fact that this technology was being centralized in the hands of unaccountable private owners, right? And he had his sights set a little higher than just slightly higher taxes on the wealthy. He wanted the government to run everything in the economy. A democratic government, mind you. Right? That would be accountable to voters, in theory. Question 8. The concept of social Darwinism, advocated by Herbert Spencer, argued for all the following except... let's see, did it argue that the government should redistribute ownership over means of production to give each individual an equal opportunity to work hard and achieve success? No. He does not want the government redistributing property because he thinks it'll end up in the hands of the less deserving, right? That he kind of argues or assumes that those who obtain property through the free market deserve it because they are more fit and they deserve to prosper and thrive and have children and propagate their genes, right? So he does believe that poverty is an indication of a person's genetic inferiority, that human society should be seen as a contest of the survival of the fittest, and that if charity were given to the poor, it would just make things worse. They would just breed and create more poor people who needed charity and were more of a drag on society. That was Herbert Spencer's idea. Question 9. The concept of free market, or laissez-faire economics, as the French would call it, argued for all of the following, except they did not want the government spending on the police and military to be abolished entirely. Now, why is that? Well, who is going to protect property ownership without the police and the military, right? And who's going to solve disputes between property owners and between businesses? You'd have a whole lot of industrial sabotage without the police and the military and the courts to settle that. So, you know, free market, supporters of free market economics always, except for some really weird fringe anarcho-capitalists, I suppose, they all make exceptions for, yes, we need government spending on the police and the military. That's the one thing the government should be spending money on, because otherwise there'll be no incentive to work hard and accumulate property, because it'll just be taken away by those who are bold enough to try to take it by force. You know, if the police aren't there. That's the thinking, at least. So they did not support this, but they did think that, you know, government regulations were unnecessary because the free market would weed out those bad companies, that individuals could rise from rags to riches if you worked hard enough, and that taxes should be kept at a minimum level because taxes do discourage investment, hard work, and economic growth. But you do need a certain minimum level of taxes to fund the police and the military. That's at, you know, at the most fundamental level, the free market economics viewpoint. So they do want to keep some taxes for that. And question 10. The social gospel movement of the late 1800s, early 1900s believed that not quite anything this radical. Not that all property should be owned in common as early Christians did. Not anything this radical, that you know, to redistribute the means of production to workers. This is what they wanted: charity and reforms to help the poor, you know, and to make the poor live safer, healthier, more stable, more moral lives, right? They did not, of course, agree that religion was the opiate of the masses, as Karl Marx claimed, because the social gospel movement was founded on, you know, from Christian churches. So they would have taken offense to that statement from Karl Marx. So here we go, 10 out of 10. All right. So that's my recap for Unit 1. Hope this has been helpful, and good luck on the test. It's due once again Saturday just before midnight. So good luck on that. And see you in the forums.